I did a YouTube video on my other channel recently, and somebody posted a really good question, and I thought it was worth making a video about it. So the question is basically, if you sell SVG files, are they considered handmade or a supply? Because you can use them to make other things. You can use them to make printables. You can use them to do POD. But if you make them, is it handmade or is it a supply? Because I think the question that underlies that is, can you take an SVG file that you get somewhere else and sell it on Etsy if you didn't make it? All right, so let's go through the process. All right, so the first thing is, let's say you have a digital file, it's a template, it's an SVG, whatever it is. If you made it, when you fill out the listing on Etsy, it'll say, did you make it or did someone else make it? As soon as you say, I made it, you designed it, you created it, you did it yourself, then it throws it into the handmade category. So if you answer, I made it, it says, who made it? I did, handmade. If you say it's a finished product, it'll say it's handmade. It says this item is handmade. If you say it's a supply, it'll say this item is a handmade supply. And a lot of my listings fall under that because I make silicone molds. So I'm making them, but it's still a supply to make something else. So I have a lot of things that are listed as handmade supplies because I made them. So if you design an SVG file, you design a digital asset, whatever it is, you're designing it, it's considered handmade, and you can put it in either category, handmade supply or just handmade, and that'll work. But even if so it doesn't matter, it's still handmade. So that falls under the handmade rules on Etsy. Now, let's say that you have gotten some files somewhere else and you're like, I'm just going to sell them on Etsy, but I didn't make them. So you go to Etsy and you put it in and it says who made it, and you say another company or person, and then it says, is it a supply or a finished product? And you put it's a supply, it'll say this item is a supply. And then you think, okay, Etsy's letting me sell it, no problem. But you have to back up, all right? Because where did you get that file? And do you have a commercial license to sell that file? And does the commercial license say that you can sell the file without altering it? Because most commercial licenses that I've seen for digital assets say that you cannot sell the digital file on its own as a standalone file the way that you bought it. You have to go in and change it in some way to make a material difference to it so that it's not the same thing. Now, that doesn't mean going in and changing a color. In Etsy's handmade policies and the definition of designer, it says that changing a color or changing a font is not considered enough to be a new design on Etsy. They don't consider you to be a designer if that's all you're doing. What they're talking about is taking different elements and putting them together to make something completely different. So let's say you have 3 different clip art elements, you put it together to make something that is not the same design that you can buy anywhere else. Now it's a new design, and yes, you can sell that because Etsy says that's okay. But you still have to go back to the original place where you bought it to see what their licensing agreement says. For example, if you have Canva Pro, they have some restrictions on how you can use those files. You have to be careful when you're buying files or getting them from a subscription somewhere, or getting them from free file sharing sites, which is the worst place to get files because you have no idea who stole them from where, because generally there's a lot of stolen files on those sites. That's where you have to look at to see what you can do with those files. So while Etsy will say, yeah, that's a supply, it doesn't mean that you can sell it because there's another step that you're ignoring. All right. So just because Etsy lets you list it, it doesn't mean that you can legally sell it. It doesn't mean that you're not going to get copyright strikes. And did you know that Etsy has a policy in their terms of use that basically says if you get Etsy sued for copyright problems or for whatever reason, you're responsible for Etsy's legal fees? Look it up. So you don't want to take a chance. Just make sure that anything that you're using on Etsy is legal to sell both on Etsy and from the terms of the use of where you got it if it's a digital file, because it is a supply, but there's a little more to it than just saying it's a supply. So just make sure you're checking, and I will talk to you later.